Having started life as a walkable village, it has the bones. It also happens to be the fastest redeveloping area in my Ward 7, so it really is the perfect opportunity to build back Cooksville in a way that really upends the stereotype of Mississauga. We all know the stereotype of Mississauga. So it is here in Mississauga, the poster city for car-centric suburban sprawl, that I have a vision for something different. A neighborhood where you can walk to most things you need on a regular basis. Your grocery store, your pharmacy, your school, your coffee shop, flower shop, library, green space. A place where once again, we have the buzz of people on streets. So I hope that tonight the discussion is not so much about should Cooksville be a 15-minute neighborhood. I hope that is a given. Instead, I want the focus to be on what are the next 3 or 4 or 5 things that have to happen to make this vision a reality. Where are the gaps and what needs to happen next? And I'm so pleased that we're hosting it today on Earth Day. I mean, what better way to honor Earth Day than to create neighborhoods that once again where walking is the norm. Lastly, I want to thank Commissioner Andrew Whittemore for enthusiastically sharing this vision for Cooksville and staff across the city. And I mean across the city because I know every division has been involved who has worked so hard to organize this forum. I also want to thank the 250 plus residents who have registered and are joining us online. I want to hear your voice tonight, your ideas, your suggestions. A special welcome to our special guests, and it is my honor now to introduce our moderator, who you've already heard a little bit, Cherise Burda. Cherise is the Executive Director at City Building Ryerson, and I think we can all agree that's exactly the kind of person to lead our discussion today. Before this, Cherise was the Ontario Director of the Pembina Institute, and she's held positions as Senior Researcher at University of Victoria's Eco-Research Chair of Environmental Law and Policy, and as a Program Director with the David Suzuki Foundation. Cherise is a strategic thinker who leverages her experience, communication skills, and leadership to bring together research, policy analysis, and leaders from diverse backgrounds to tackle today's critical urban challenges. Welcome and thank you, Cherise, for joining us, and I look forward to a great forum.
Thank you so much, Councillor, and it's great to hear your amazing vision. And I would just also a shout out to Mayor Crombie. I've really, since the mayor has been in charge, I have seen such huge difference in Mississauga, and all of us city builders really look to Mississauga as examples of where amazing things can be done, where transit-oriented development happens, where density and redevelopment and thoughtful master plan communities can happen. And I think if a 15-minute city can happen anywhere, really it's Mississauga. So I am so excited to be talking about this excellent, timely topic. So when we think about where we live and experience our neighborhoods, think specifically about Cooksville and Mississauga. I'm assuming that most of the people who are watching this are from this area. And as the mayor so aptly pointed out, since the start of the pandemic, many of us have spent our last year closer to home than ever before. And we've relied on our neighborhood services more than ever before. And so what has happened over the past year has changed where people go and has encouraged us to stay local and perhaps getting around in your own neighborhood within 15 minutes by foot or bike. I found it really fascinating that the councillor pointed out that this area was already a walkable 15-minute neighborhood, and then it wasn't. And so why couldn't it go back? So I'm just learning stuff already. So in some ways, our cities over the pandemic have shrunk, and we are rediscovering the importance of proximity for sure. So the idea of the 16 or 15-minute or 16-minute city or neighborhood is an interesting way to think about how we plan where we live, work, shop, play, and go to school. So we're here tonight to learn more about this concept and its principles and how it can be transferred to Cooksville in Mississauga. So let's introduce our smart panelists who are going to walk us through all of these exciting possibilities. So our first panelist is Neluka Leanage. She is founder of an award-winning startup called SafeGround and principal at Groundshift Consulting. Neluka is devoted to fostering vibrant, safe, and inclusive places for pedestrians, cyclists, and drivers. She brings together her expertise and passion to challenge current thinking with data-driven equity and user experience lenses to inform plans, strategies, and frameworks. She has led many active transportation and trails plans, walkability and safety audits, as well as served on the steering committee for the Center for Active Transportation for 4 years. Neluka has a PhD, or is a PhD candidate at the School of Planning at University of Waterloo, with a focus on active transit, public spaces, livability, and transformational solutions to urban challenges. She has led research and published on the topics of future-proofing cities with pedestrian-oriented development, smart growth, uneven residential intensification, and overcoming obstacles to sustainable urban development. She has led key research on downtowns and building active communities in Indigenous and other urban settings. Notably, she's co-authored a discussion paper looking at how the 15-minute walking city can save intensification hubs in and beyond COVID-19. So thanks for joining us tonight. Our second panelist is Alex Bozikovic. He is the architecture critic and journalist at the Globe and Mail. In his columns, Alex mixes reporting and critical analysis to reveal what is happening in the built environment and to advocate for buildings and better cities. And I'll just say, Alex is such an incredible columnist and really knows how to put his expertise and thought into, not just reporting on stuff, but actually getting us to think about how things can be better. So Alex's work spans a diverse range of urban topics, including affordable housing, post-pandemic future, urban design, and how architecture shapes our daily lives. I would also add that's not here, as he's an expert on the missing middle. Alex's work consistently situates architectural projects in a social context to give an understanding of why design matters and advocates for good architecture. He is the co-author of a great book called Toronto Architecture, A City Guide 2017, and he has won a National Magazine Award and has written for design publications such as Azure, Blueprint, Dwell, Spacing, and Wallpaper. Notably, Alex was a guest speaker on the Big Story podcast, which focused on how we can build 15-minute cities where we live and how to make changes for the future. Thank you for joining us tonight, Alex.
Great to be here. That's a very kind introduction, Cherise. Thank you.
Wow, this is so exciting. We have so much ground to cover. Let's start with some kind of bigger picture general questions. And, a lot of us have been talking about the 15-minute city. Like, I use it all the time as if like everybody knows it. And what is that? So let's start by defining this concept. What is the 15-minute city and where does the concept come from? So let's start with Neluka.
Yeah, thank you, Cherise, and thank you very much for inviting me and having me here today. Okay, so really the 15-minute city, it's a hyper-local neighborhood planning model. And like everybody's already kind of mentioned, it's a way of spatially organizing all of the activities around that 15-minute walk or cycle of where we live. So that is all the work, our shopping, restaurants, entertainment, culture, education, healthcare, libraries, sport facilities, all of it, right? And really the key criteria of the model is that it's got to facilitate access to most amenities through everyday walking and cycling compared to other models that are based on driving. And it also requires safe, high quality public spaces so that people will want to cycle or walk to reach these amenities. The concept was developed by a professor and an innovation thinker named Carlos Moreno in 2019. And it was popularized by Paris's mayor, Anne Hidalgo, right before COVID hit. And she used it actually as part of her platform to win re-election. So it's kind of cool. A lot of support there for it. And Moreno's concept, it's really actually like, if we look at where this concept really comes from, it's heavily influenced by Jane Jacobs, which a lot of people know. She was very vocal here in the Toronto region. And her vision was for vibrant, walkable communities that had a mix of land uses. They had short blocks and really active street facades that were suited to the rhythm of walking. And even before that, there was Clarence Perry who developed something called the neighborhood unit. And he was trying to actually reduce the influx of automobiles that were coming, in the 1920s on our horizon. And he wanted to reduce their impact on our neighborhoods. So he was trying to prescribe a sort of family and pedestrian friendly neighborhood that was based actually on a much smaller walk, a 5-minute walk. And it had sort of a school or community center in the middle, and then it was surrounded by houses. And then that's when you got bounded by your main shopping streets that a lot of us can see in some of the traditional neighborhoods. And then even in between these periods, like a lot of the planners that might be here on the call and people who are sort of really interested in cities have already sort of kept up. There's lots of variations of the walkable community models out there. So some people may have heard of new urbanism, traditional neighborhoods, complete communities is a newer one. So it's actually not a brand new concept, but it's a really timely concept.
Great, that's super helpful. I like that you also included a lot of like similar concepts, like because we hear about transit-oriented development, we hear about complete communities, and this is kind of, they're all part of one of each other, but I think that this is really about how much time it takes to get around to many of these things. So keeping that in mind, Alex, why is 15-minute city so important when we have all of these other ways of describing things? Why is it so desirable to have a 15-minute city, and how can it change our lives?
Well, I think it's a really useful piece of rhetoric. Neluka was just saying that, the idea in these terms is new, but clearly it has a long history. I think it's easily digestible. I think, right in that one phrase, you understand very clearly what the idea is. And it's an idea that people can get their heads around. A complete community is planning jargon that, even if you learn what it is, doesn't quite have the same kind of power. But the idea that you would be able to find everything you need or find most of what you need within a 15-minute trip from home, I think is very powerful. And there are very few people who really have that in Mississauga or almost anywhere else in this country. There are very few people who have that experience. So I think it's a really a powerful, sorry, my kids are making some noise. It's a very powerful idea and a really appealing goal to shoot for.
Okay, perfect. So let's get from here to on the ground. Let's get into the nuts and bolts, and let's start to talk about how this concept plays out on the ground in the built environment. I'm going to turn this question over to Neluka, but also, Jasmine, do you mind putting up that slide of the features of the 15-minute city slide that Neluka, you can speak to?
Okay, great, thanks. So sort of from like a bigger picture planning perspective, some of the main thing, all the features that are listed here are definitely important. And maybe I'll just highlight a couple that you definitely have to have that proximity. So like Alex said, the importance of time is important here. So that proximity to amenities, and you need to have a density of people. And usually in order to get that density of people, you need to have residential density. So that's important too. You need to have year-round accessible animation of the public realm. So the public realm becomes this really critical piece. And then lastly, the piece that I think is also really important here is we need to be paying attention to engaging a diversity of people in this model and in making the model, as we call it, placemaking. So we have to sort of, I think, leverage the 15-minute city and its momentum to become a placemaking exercise where lots of people get engaged around it. One of the things I like to sort of describe is sort of take a more experiential view so people can get a better grounding of what this really means. So sometimes I like to think of it from a real person's perspective as they're like walking along the street, so to speak. So if you can imagine that it's this vibrant place, yeah, and the photos here on the slide are great. If this vibrant place that encourages maybe a working parent who maybe gets off the bus at 9 o'clock at night, right? Seems kind of late, but they can do it. They get off the bus after work. They maybe stop and pick up a few groceries. They chat a little with maybe a neighbor that they see in the store. And then they walk home and they have this feeling that it's convenient, it's safe, there's a sense of connection, you know, in their community. Or another way to think of it too, because we're here in a Canadian climate, is like if you were, say, a retired couple spending time over a weekend and it's in the winter, you know, are you able to stroll through the local park, maybe pick up a hot chocolate en route, where one person maybe goes to a library, the other goes and gets a haircut, they meet again a little bit later and grab some food at a market, and then, you know, head home, that kind of thing. So that's how I like to think about how it might actually feel if you lived in a 15-minute city.
Okay, great for that. I think we can probably take this slide off and just look at everybody's faces. So Alex, I'm gonna ask you so this concept, we've seen the concept, we've heard a little bit about how it plays on the ground. I'm still a little bit fuzzy, like how does it play out really in places? So can you share some examples from either in Canada or North America or around the world where there is a 15-minute city, and like some specific examples so we can wrap our head around, like, okay, yeah, I know what that part of the city looks like. Yeah, this is why it's a 15-minute city.
Gotcha. Well, the tricky part is that finding examples of the 15-minute city really are quite rare in suburbs. They're really quite rare in any municipality that was built after the arrival of the car, right? This is the big challenge. So when a couple of colleagues of mine and I did some research on the 15-minute city across Canada, we used some StatsCan data and CMHC data to look at where these places were, municipality by municipality. In the places that had the largest areas that were 15-minute cities, or were amenity rich, as StatsCan likes to call it, were Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. The biggest percentage in a city was actually Vancouver, because the city of Vancouver itself is quite compact. But if you look at central Toronto, you get a similar thing. Take a central Toronto neighborhood like the Annex. So, aside from the presence of the University of Toronto there, you've got a main street with shops and restaurants of all kinds. You have schools, you have parks, you have recreational facilities, you have transit that will connect you to the larger city, and you even have entertainment venues. So that's a pretty good, pretty clear example. Finding places where a 15-minute city has been created in a suburban context is trickier. I think Portcredit Village actually is one of the few really good examples anywhere in this region where you more or less pull that off. Because it has these things. It's got retail and restaurants. It's got a good public realm, places where, that couple Neluka was imagining might want to hang out, public facilities, and all of that's tied together by a certain density of people, at least residents, if not jobs.
Yeah, those are great examples. I love the pork Reddit example because the goat train is there as well. And we're
Thank
seeing
you. Yes.
and we're seeing
Crucial.
a lot of also development, a lot of master plan, like a Brightwater happening there that can really bring in a mixed community that can spend most of its time walking and cycling and maybe even shuttling to that. So that's a really good example, Alex. Before I move on to this really cool interactive map that we're gonna bring up in a second, Alex, just one more thing. Do you want to? Are there any other examples that you think are worth noting, either in Canada, North America, or should we just get straight into Cooksville?
I think it's good to get straight into Cooksville. I guess I would just say one quick note, which is that this is sort of a new frame, as we've already said, a new way of articulating something that people have already pursued in the past. But other examples of suburban planned communities, including Bramalea, kind of sound like the same thing. But what we're talking about here, as Neluka said very clearly, is something that has very tightly focused on a particular place. So you're really thinking about the experience of a linked set of places that are close together rather than this big picture. So that seems like an important point.
Yeah, that's a really important point. It helps me to visualize it better. Okay, let's get to the cool visual. So we've got this, we've got it. Mississauga created it. You guys created it. Let's get to talk about it. It's this cool interactive map that I think Neluka is going to use to get us on the ground with this concept. So this map and images of Cooksville, help to situate the conversation. So if you lived close to here, Ontario and Dundas, the map points out amenities that are found within 15-minute walking distance. So yeah, like you can just look at your location, what can you walk to, what amenities are there. And a lot of times 15 minutes isn't just walking oh great, there's an auto body shop. It's often like not just the quantity of amenities, but also the quality of amenities. So it's really good to get this look. Neluka, over to you. What stands out for you with this great map?
Yeah, it's a really good example, like the counselor mentioned, of how it already has a history and it already has sort of a kind of a base grid. So that's one of the first things that stood out to me. It's obviously a really important and historical intersection right there as well. And then, you can see from the map that you've got all these great icons. The number and diversity of amenities, like ranging from the shops to the food, different parks. You can even see some trails there. The types of services, like in the map there was a screenshot there where it listed the sort of the number of banks and restaurants and things like that. But so you have all these services, like over 100 services, or 300 services there, right? The transit options too. Now they're not highlighted there, but I think maybe in my next map, but there's a cluster of like lots of transit options and transit routes as well. So that's important. And so it's really impressive to see that quantity and the diversity. And it also shows to me that it's catering to a diverse population here, and it makes it highly accessible for residents from both like the accessing a variety of amenities, but also from the transportation point of view. There's just a lot of access points, right? So if you go to that next slide, unless Alex wanted to jump in and say anything on that slide too.
No, please continue.
No. Okay. So for the next slide, the walking and cycling slide, what I did is I took the walk shed that Mississauga had presented, and I sort of wanted to drill down a little bit more. And so just in this map, you can see the black dashed line. That's still the outline of the 15-minute city there. And what I was realizing was that about 90% or more of the sidewalk network is actually complete here in the walkshed. That's great. There's also ample sized public corners. So that's something that doesn't happen very often. They're quite large at some of the main intersections, and that's a lot of space for people to stand and wait, socialize, talk. Now it does need some seating, I would say. And then the sidewalk widths are actually pretty decent too. So that's unlike a lot of sort of historical centers that have really narrow sidewalks. It is missing some cycling facilities, and some of the accessibility infrastructure is missing or needs some upgrading here. And then there's some real opportunities, because you've got, like, at the main intersection there, here, Ontario and Dundas. I mean, these are 6 lanes and a median. These are wide roads. But it does mean that there's plenty of space to make these streets complete streets. And then you've got the LRT coming, and that means that's also going to transform here, Ontario. And so there's a real opportunity and great timing here to be making sure that the needs of all road users become safer and integrated. The public realm can be livened up. You know, we can start to, with that amount of space, we can really start to expand further with adding, you know, seating, shelters, art, lighting, separated cycle lanes, bike parking, all of that good stuff that you really want. Another thing that I noticed here in the 50-minute city, if you take a look at those photographs, is that there's really a variety of walking environments. They're not all the same. So yeah, you do have some of the fast, wide arterials that are there with some strip plazas, but and they do pose some safety challenges, but there you can see that there's also some slower, quieter streets and things with trees, which is really nice. And then I was also noticing that, kind of like the councillor mentioned, it's got this historical grid in that 15-minute watershed compared to other parts of Mississauga, you know, that have the curvilinear streets and the more suburban types of road systems. So, you know, this is a really good starting point. I kind of highlighted there 500 meters just because that's a starting point, but you can see how, like, there's already sort of attempts at, like, putting the trails through there that kind of break up those block lengths and make them more connected. So that's a really good thing to see. And also the other thing I was thinking was some of the cycling infrastructure you see there in purple, not quite going into that core area where all the amenities are. So that probably needs to be extended so that you get those connections, you know, make it more accessible into that core so more people can use it. Those are some of the things that just jumped out at me anyway.
Alex, do you want to jump in there? We just saw a lot of visuals, and you know, we were just talking about, like, this goes back to, like, the good bones, right? And that, like, the wide, you know, we look at wide streets and we go, it's huge, right? But you can actually contain it into a complete street. There's, you know, lots of sidewalk space, which, you know, is amazing. It's a grid. So what really sparks your interest in how this could be transferred to Cooksville?
Well, I wasn't aware until just the other day while I was looking at the area that there was a branch library right here upstairs, you know, not far from the intersection of Dundas and Huron, Ontario. And I see that in the city's planning for the neighborhood, creating a community hub or a community center of some kind, possibly including a library, you know, is already there. And I think that's a fantastic idea. I think, you know, the presence of, it's become clear over the last decade that libraries in many communities have come to serve a broader function than they used to. They really are gathering places for people from all walks of life and people of all ages, and can really create a sense of community and a sense of vitality. So, I mean, that's a really valuable thing. And the fact that the city's already planning to try and capitalize on that and to give a library a prominent place, I think, you know, is a great idea. I think that really speaks well to, you know, to what might happen here.
Oh, I love that you discovered that. Libraries are just so vital to our community connectivity. Okay, so before we go to the next question, Jasmine, would you mind bringing up the slide that is called Opportunities and Challenges?
Oh, or Cherise, before that, can we jump to
do you
the
want to go into
density
this?
slide?
Okay,
Yeah.
you still want to do that? Okay, no
Sure,
worries.
because I think Alex can jump in here too.
Okay.
I had a couple points, but you know, now this isn't, you know, bear with the ugly slide here, folks. This is just it's tricky to illustrate density, but so I've tried to put the walking shed over Google's 3D buildings here, just to show that there's actually already a decent amount of and variety of high to low rise residences here. As well as like in the outer parts of the shed, there's the more single family detached housing, but this is really good. Like a lot of places, like Alex said, suburban areas don't have this kind of density to start with, right? And it's so important to have density because basically density of people animate spaces and they use the amenities. So if you don't have the density, you're never going to have people kind of out in the streets creating that vibrant, lively place, right? So I like to think of it as, you know, people often say, if you build it, they will come, which can be true. But more importantly, if people are there, more people will come. So people attract people. So this is a really good thing. And I think Alex can probably speak to the other types of density that is possible here.
Yeah, Alex, because you've been studying all different kinds of density. And I think that what's really also interesting is during this pandemic, people have looked at density as a negative thing. And so help us all out on this.
So there was a lot of talk about a year ago when the pandemic first hit, that density was the problem, cities were the problem. You know, a sort of anti-city academic in California was all over the TV and radio talking about how this was the end of cities, a guy called Joel Kotkin. You know, I think that is clearly not the case. But more relevantly for our discussion here, you know, not only are people not abandoning the densest of cities, but the problem in terms of the pandemic with density is not people living in apartment buildings, it's people living in homes together, right? I mean, where we've seen a lot of community transmission of COVID has been within households that are large, and where people often are working outside of the home, right? So that is a question of housing affordability. It's a question of providing adequate housing to everyone in the community. It's not a reason to stop building apartment buildings or to desire to move out and live in separate houses far away from other people. So, you know, this impulse that we heard a lot about last year, that essentially, you know, people would want to separate, and that the idea of coming together in community was, you know, somehow going to be dangerous because of this disease. You know, that's not true. And people want to be with other people. You know, as you were just saying, I think that's a really, you know, crucial point. Where do you create places that people will actually want to spend time and to see each other and find community?
Yeah, and I'll just jump in and say, like, some of the gentler density, right, can be things like, you know, there can be mid-rises, of course, but things like stacked townhouses and live-work type buildings and things like that. And there's, I think maybe later in a different slide, you'll see, like, there's a lot of parking lots here, which have totally the perfect opportunity to start introducing or infilling with some of these, you know, different types of density.
Excellent. I think the three of us could talk about density like all night long. So did you, Neluka, did you want to show a cycling slide first or before we move on to this, or are you good with this?
No, this is good.
You're good to go into opportunities and challenges?
Yeah.
Okay, let's do it. All right. So what are some of, like, clearly it's all great and we've got some good bones and we've got like a lot, like in terms of the built form, it can be massaged, it can be changed. We're seeing that it actually is really ripe for this. So what are the challenges? What are the real challenges besides the built form, and what are some of the opportunities that we can expect in this area?
Yeah, it's an important question, and in some respects, it's not that different than other types of places that face some of these same challenges because we've been so automobile oriented for so long. So, you can see from just the images, the amount of space that roads take up and the prominence given to them, whether it's parking lots and then the lanes. This is a lot of space, right? And it's actually a very costly thing for municipalities, and it's expensive to build and maintain and that kind of thing. So that's one of the key challenges here, but it's an important part, is to reduce the prominence of the car to make the space for other types of road users, right? So although this is here Ontario and Dundas, and there's going to be the LRT coming, I mean, this is going to bring a lot of change. And what will be really important, the opportunity here, though, is to make sure that walking, cycling, and accessibility infrastructure, that they're integrated at this early planning phase and designed at the same time. They're not left as an afterthought, afterwards, as a way of doing things like that. So they have to be done right from the start. Another thing as well, as part of the essential piece of the 15-minute city, is that you have to have these well-designed, high-quality public spaces, and they need to be for all ages, all abilities, really people-friendly, right? Otherwise, you may have people who are walking there, but they're doing it despite the environment, not because the environment's so great that it's attracting them to go there. So it's not a place to hang out, it's a place just to get through, right? So like Alex said, they don't become gathering places, they become thoroughfares, right? So that's really important. And that intersection in particular, where most of the amenities are and where most people will catch the transit and congregate to shop, that becomes a core destination. And so, partly that removing of the parking lots as well that I mentioned and infilling them with other uses. This is where it doesn't have to just be residential uses. It could be parkettes, could be things like bike share, bike parking. And what's important here is that you ask the community and different groups in the community, what are the things that they would like that would attract them to use these spaces. In that the other picture there with the strip plaza, this is also a really tricky built form to modify. So there's a high prevalence of these across a lot of cities, actually, not just Cooksville. You can see they're kind of set back. Well, so they do make it tricky to alter. But one of the things that the pandemic, I think, heightened for us is that there's sort of an opportunity to get really creative, maybe provide incentives to add pop-up shops at the front of these plazas. So a lot of urban main streets don't have frontage. Here you've got frontage, so you could actually put things there. Pop-up shops, patios, outdoor grocery stands, like markets and all that kind of good stuff. And one of the things that struck me when I glanced quickly at the census data for Cooksville, this has got to be one of the most ethnically diverse areas in Ontario, maybe Canada. So one thing I wondered about was, is there an appetite from business owners whose countries of origin, really, they've mastered outdoor food, pop-up shops and markets? Like every place that I've been, these are some of the great experiences that you like when you travel. Like, why not bring it here?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great idea. I would just add one point. Well, let me float two ideas that might be a little bit unorthodox in the urban design context. I think that's a great idea. Food absolutely brings people together, and the presence of food and dining is really, really great. If you're trying to create a sense of vitality and create a sense of community. I think one tricky thing is here, pop-ups are a great idea. I agree completely. But over the longer term, there's kind of a consensus in the urban design world that in dealing with situations like this one, in dealing with places like this, that you take the street and you try and create to make it more walkable or give the street more character, right? Make it a place where people will want to walk along. And so that you wind up getting storefronts facing an arterial road like these ones, right? So instead of a strip mall in here, Ontario, maybe you have stores right up against the street with the sidewalk. I would just advise you all to question that idea a little bit because I don't think it actually works very well. I haven't seen where it's actually been really successful because whatever you do to an arterial road, having a lot of traffic that moves quickly just never makes for a really pleasant place to be. So, sort of hoping that that's going to work out in the long term may not be advisable, but creating other kinds of public space, parks or other kinds of public space that are not facing this, open to the street, but not completely along the street. In other words, courtyards, plazas, that public spaces that follow other models, I think will probably be more successful here. Another thing I would say, and to Neluka's point about food, that we don't really put commerce and parks together very well. We tend to think of parks as one thing. We tend to think about commercial activity, including restaurants, as being another thing. And we don't often combine them. And that's really a shame because I think that combination of commerce and public space can be really, really successful. I mean, that makes interesting places and interesting streets. And the plaza at Port Credit does that, and I think is quite a successful place. So that might be a particular model of, worth looking at.
Those are such great points. I just love your point about trying to force an arterial into something that's walkable. And like, unless you totally change the road or unless you're doing a big, massive, like redesign, like Golden Mile, you need to be looking at kind of what's on the other side, right? What are the laneways access or the courtyards? How can you have stuff built into that neighborhood, but not necessarily have to have a patio on a 6-lane thoroughfare? So I think that's really, really important to keep remembering. I love that. Okay, so you have kind of segued into the next question, which is about how policy planners play a role in developing a 15-minute city. And you have any advice for planners? Let's start with, we'll go with Alex first and then over to Neluka.
I mean, my job is usually to sort of talk in general terms rather than to give people specific advice. But I mean, I think we've really covered already a couple of the most important themes. A really clear emphasis on the public realm and not just having a public realm, but making it really good and being very strategic about what is going to be successful and what's going to be important, right? Like to really sort of pick the spots that are going to be public and most public in character and are going to be most pleasant to hang around. So whether that's a library next to a park, next to a cafe and a restaurant, or at some other combination of public spaces or public uses, being really clear about where the energy and the emphasis is, where are people going to want to go? Where can we make it pleasant for them to go so that it's visually interesting? There's stuff to do. There is shade. There is protection from the elements so it's comfortable in 4 seasons. I guess that's one really clear point is, everyone knows. I mean, there's smarter people than me on this call who, are going to be focused on making a good public realm. But I guess I would just say to be really, being really strategic and focused in how you build that seems important.
Neluka?
Well, yeah, I think Alex covered it. The only thing I might add is because of our winter climate and what happens in a lot of places in our winter or colder or wetter times is you just don't have people there. So to make something vibrant and lively, one of the things I don't think we're great at here in Canada, but we can definitely take lessons from some of the other Northern European countries, are the winter city plans and designs. And I think this moving forward, like whether it's the pandemic or not, but what's absolutely important, right, is people need to be outside. So especially for the households, multi-family households, they need access to that fresh air and the space. And so you need, especially in our winter environments when we're all enclosed, we've got, forced air or air circulating around. Now that's really become important and prominent to us. So you have to have those kind of winter city options. and get creative with that. I think that that is going to grow in importance. And, you know, there's lots of newcomers who, you know, they need additional supports in terms of how to experience winter and that kind of thing. I've certainly spent a lot of time with new friends and family and really helped to get them outside more, because there's a kind of a tendency for all of us to hibernate, right?
Okay, we're almost done. We got 2 more questions. So this question I will ask of both of you. I think we have enough time. How can municipalities and stakeholders work together to implement this concept in the ground? Huge question, but maybe just each of you come up with one thing.
Go ahead, Alex. Oh,
Alex, you're on mute. Start
Of course
again.
I am. Sorry. Let me repeat myself with the mic on. I was just saying that governments, all levels of government, really need to be on the same page with their investments and with their goals for a place like this. Governments generally are not good at doing stuff in terms of place. This is particularly true of our senior levels of government. I mean, I don't know whether the province is now looking at redeveloping the parking lots at the GO station, which they probably are, and they absolutely should be. But, you know, also, if there's a way to, you know, rebuild or improve the long-term care facility that's already here, for instance, and combine that into a facility that is also a library or other kinds of municipal facilities, it's really valuable to bring different public amenities together and to bring the pools of capital that come with them, because you get a different sort of creating a sense of publicness or reinforcing a sense of public amenity, I think is really valuable. So if people can cooperate and combine different programs, different purposes into the same place or even into the same building, that's something we should do and we generally don't do, and seems like it would be valuable here.
Okay, great. I'm just going to let you know that we're just about to go to the Q&As, but we just have one final question from me.
Can I just answer that? Can I just jump in on that last question, Cherise?
Oh, I'm so sorry. You go ahead.
Yeah, so the one point I would make about this is that to look at the 15-minute city, it's got a lot of momentum behind it, a lot of interest, and to leverage this as a placemaking tool. So I think that there's real opportunity here for, if you're talking about stakeholders, but really we're talking about soliciting a range of voices who are going to help shape Cooksville. And I think that if we can start to shift some of our traditional planning processes and design ways that we actually get diverse groups included in those processes, you know, whether that's things like engaging residents in auditing their streets and their neighborhoods for what's not working, what would work for them. You know, some of these processes, you call them co-design, but having them share their ideas. And you know, I'm going to point out some of the groups here, like business owners, for example, like when I talk about those strip plazas, you know, what could be done, but they're a hard group sometimes that don't typically engage. Pedestrians and cyclists, there's a much wider sort of group of pedestrians and accessibility folks that need to be included in the conversation, and then those equity groups, I would say. So I'm going to say that there's a real opportunity here for placemaking.
Thank you. Okay, we are going to go to the Q&A, and sorry, I look distracted because I'm getting the questions through WhatsApp on my phone. So other people in the background have been doing the hard work of selecting 3 awesome questions. So we're going to get started on those. And just to remind everybody that if your question isn't answered, I believe that the folks here in the city is going to do the best to answer your questions and post it on the project site. All right, so let's start with, this one's super interesting. Okay, can you speak to any unintended consequences of the 15-minute city and how we make the transition? Alex, you're smiling. I'm going to turn this to you.
I mean, I'm not sure I have a great answer to that question. I mean, as much as you can create walkability and add density here, you know, in a concentrated way near good transit, I mean, there really is no meaningful downside that I can see. I mean, I guess reaching, you know, the way that cars are managed and the way in which traffic is managed, you know, people tend to be very fussy about traffic. And municipalities tend to be very conservative about managing traffic and about requiring parking. You know, I guess that is one, you know, you could wind up in a situation where either, you know, traffic is difficult because you have a bunch of density and people are still driving, or you could also wind up with an urban design that privileges cars still too heavily in order to, you know, is too car heavy to be really comfortable or to be really pleasant. So looking on the dark side.
Neluka,
And I'll just add sort of back to the placemaking piece, but the equity groups that need to be sort of given greater support to participate in these processes, because, you know, sometimes I've worked on a lot of pedestrian cycling types of projects, and sometimes you get, I would call them the usual suspects out at meetings. And so sometimes like these can be people who are strong, fearless cycle riders, right? That's not going to be how we create great places for cycling and walking for people who aren't familiar with cycling, for example, or families or different generations. Like, so you have to really reach out and make I think, a concerted effort about including a diverse group of people and hearing from them about what would make them comfortable to start, you know, getting on board and trying, and, you know, these kinds of things. And sometimes that's programs that you need to support people, right? Having fun activities and programming that all supports the change that you want to see long term.
Fantastic point.
Yeah, I think that's, you both have made really good points that sort of make me think about, you know, the idea of making sure that everybody's involved, but also trying not to do everything with one place for everyone, for every road users. Like we've seen how in the past, the most successful streets have chosen a couple priorities. So if we look at, you know, streets like Harvard that have said, we're going to prioritize cycling, or, you know, Roncesvalles that really I'm using Toronto examples, prioritize pedestrians. But, you know, if you look at Queens Quay, when that was a, you know, perfect complete street that had a lane for every single person and car, every single user, then you might be, you know, running into territory where there's confusion. So I think your point about making sure that you're approaching the right needs. I'm just going to keep going on that thread though with a question to Neluka, which is, where'd that question go? Is it? Oh, here it is. You've talked about the role of diversity and accessibility.
Mm-hmm.
And can you dive in further, and how do we plan from an equity lens? I guess when it comes to a city.
Yeah, so I mean, the great thing is I think this has all hit our radar a lot more in the past year as well. So there's some, you know, there's people who've already built several tools out there. I'm not familiar, I haven't looked up the city of Mississauga. It probably has some equity lenses that can already be used or certainly be modified, but those are tools where, you know, you start to look at all the decisions, plans and visions and things, and you sort of filter them through a lens and ask some really critical questions like, who are we planning for, right? Is this going to serve the interests of, you know, and have we included those people in the discussion? So I think there's sort of that policy equity lens that you start with that, but then there's the things that I mentioned before where you drill down into, you know, the actual processes of consultation and engagement. And there's a whole bunch of options that are available now for planners and officials, but you don't even have to start with that. There's community groups already out there that are using their own like sort of people power, if you will, and like I mentioned, documenting and auditing their own spaces and sort of presenting that back to cities, right? And sort of advocating themselves to be included and to be included more meaningfully. So I think there's both the sort of top down and the bottom up, and the two of them can kind of coalesce in the middle there. And there's some, techniques like design thinking techniques that are out there now, where you have cities engaging in like design charrettes and things like that, right? So you're kind of all in on it and collaborating and figuring things out, right, together. I think the more that we have that, the better that will be.
That really feeds into this next question, which is, what is the role of culture and located artists to animate the city? Anyone want to use that?
I mean, cultural facilities can really punch above their weight, in the sense that having a relatively small number of people working, even if there aren't that many people involved, and even if they're not actually, selling that much stuff, let's say, if you don't have a performing arts center, can really create a sense of place. And, I think that's valuable. And there are certainly, a number of different lenses, a number of different organizations who I'm sure the city's already working with, that can help, do that arts as placemaking. I mean, I do think that's powerful. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got two more questions here. I'm just gonna turn to the boss and one or two? Two. Okay, great. So we're gonna start with this one. How do we strike a balance with density? We're getting on this favorite topic. How do we encourage more density in a way that gets more people out on the streets, walking and actually activating the streets? So we know that density does that. So I think maybe the question, Alex, is like, what's optimal density to make a place livable, but to create the necessary ground level activity and animation to make businesses successful?
Well, I mean, I'm not a planner, and it's hard for me to come up with a exact number or even to kind of eyeball it. But what I would say is, to use a sort of Twitter provocative Twitter hashtag, ban cars. The harder you go in restricting car use, in limiting parking, in trying to push new development to be as car light as possible, the better the results will be. And it's not necessarily that easy to sell a condo to everybody or to rent an apartment to anybody, in Mississauga with no cars. But the market for car-free or car-light living is bigger than people think it is. And if you're going to do transit-oriented communities, transit-oriented density, really, I would just suggest that the city and every city should be very bold in pushing in that direction. See how far you can get in having as few cars as possible and as little provision for cars as possible. Because people who aren't driving are the people who are going to be walking through your 15-minute city and making it alive.
That's a really great point. And can I just build on that too? Because you can already see, like through the pandemic, there's been the temporary installations, like whether it's street closures or temporary bike lanes and temporary sidewalk widening and things like that, and people use them, right? And so there's an opportunity to convert those into something more permanent. So again, like to Alex's point, be strategic, but some cities are experimenting with having they start with small car-free areas, and to me, the pandemic closures of roads and slow streets and all of that kind of stuff is on that spectrum, right? And the more we in North America start to experience what that's like that's new for a lot of us, right? We're not familiar with that unless you go to Europe or something. So that's new, and all these demonstration projects, I think, and pilot projects help pave the way to some of that conversion. And then the other thing I was just going to say about the density piece is we have a model here across the GTA of this sort of podium style with the tall tower, right? And that's not a really great model for walking and cycling. So it does add density, but you usually get these sort of wide swaths of building. The actual building that's on the sidewalk is not very activating. It's not an active storefront for pedestrians and things. And they often create a lot of wind and cold that sort of gets in there. So I would just say that there's other models, architectural models out there that activate the street a bit better. And even things like that, things like the strip plaza, I often think of things like that as now there's ways to infill some of those spaces that bring the building closer to the sidewalk, right? And even build on top and things like that. But there's a lot of different creative ways that I don't think we're doing yet here, but there's potential.
Okay, so yes, I'm hearing one last question. Okay. So we, or you guys talked about parks being important to the 15-minute city. How do parks and the public realm enable placemaking? Neluka?
Yeah. Sure. Well, I mean, number one, they are an attractor of people, right? So parks are car free. So surprise, you're safe. Generally, you're not going to get hit if you are in a park or on a trail, right? So these are really typically welcoming places, and they are designed by designers who are trying to create experiences. So they have already sort of a built-in design and interest in making the place great for people. And I guess, there's a lot of opportunity, like Alex mentioned before, about combining some pieces of aspects of parks. I know I saw in the chat, somebody mentioned dog parks, and we've all heard of pandemic puppies, but there's going to be probably a massive growth in the need for more parks and open spaces and things like that. And that's really critical too, because when you start adding density, you need to be providing the open spaces for people who are living in higher density, right? That's one of the trade-offs, that if you live in higher density, you have access to great amenities and public spaces. So, yeah.
Alex, do you want to add to that?
I mean, the parks are the center of any good community, right? I mean, they really are, they are where people come together. And I guess I would just echo the point I made earlier, which is, something that I often see missing generally in North America, is that we see parks and we see public life, as to use Jan Gale's term, as being something that's kind of separate from commerce in new developments. There's the idea that a park is kind of a refuge and a green space that's apart from the city. And I do think, certainly specific amenities, have to be thought through really carefully. Dog parks are a big deal, and how you manage dogs in public space is a big deal. Are your parks designed to survive dogs if they're not in the dog run or in the, but yeah, I mean, the combination of public space with activity, including commercial activity, I think can be really lively. That's, if you put a restaurant with a patio facing a park, or cafe with tables in a park, people will use those spaces. And it always kind of mystifies me that we don't see more of that kind of juxtaposition.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to build on Alex's point, like that's another type of programming, right? So parks have, there's a food security component to that, right? So you can have community gardens, and I mean, that animates parks as well. People can start to grow their own food. There's like different types of playgrounds. Like they don't all have to be sort of the usual neon colored kind of slide stuff. And that, again, it's important to ask residents, what the parks should include. I know in Toronto, when I was used to live there, there was a conversation around whether or not, like a lot of the parks had outdoor skating rinks and hockey rinks, but in a whole bunch of the neighborhoods, this was no longer relevant. People weren't really playing hockey in those neighborhoods. And so I think there was some that converted to cricket field, right? And so I think that like animating the parks and building in the programming to suit the needs of residents, again, is really important.
Okay, great. I love ending on parks. That's awesome. Thanks to you both. This was such a great conversation. There's so much more to talk about here, and I think this is just the beginning of really exploring this for Cooksville. Okay, so I think we're going to move up to hear from Christian Bennett, who's the planner at the City of Mississauga, who's going to now provide an overview of the policy changes proposed for Cooksville.